Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Calgary's 9th Annual Legacy Society event. My name is Kate Wong, and I'm delighted to be here and be your MC for this very special occasion. I'm the president and chair of the UCalgary Alumni Association and a proud alumna from the class of 2012. I received my Bachelor of Nursing at UCalgary and have been a registered nurse in pediatrics ever since. Currently, I'm a doctoral candidate studying children's experiences of serious illness, and I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Nursing, a brand new one I just taught on Friday for the first time. Thank you very much. We are thrilled to get the chance to celebrate the wonderful work made possible by you, our philanthropic community. The reasons I was asked to MC this evening's event is because I used to work for Dr. Sinclair, so I'm thrilled that you get to hear from him this evening. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Ed McCauley, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Calgary, to offer his greetings and introduce our keynote presenter.
Thank you so much. I'll have to adjust the microphone just a little bit. I knew that would bring Kate back. So good evening, everybody. Really, it's a very, very special evening. Great to see so many friends here at the from the University of Calgary. It's always a great privilege to be here with members of the Legacy Society to honor your extraordinary commitment to the University of Calgary. We cannot do it without you. I hope you've seen some of the text scrolling by on the screens while you're having your dinner and your conversations. Your university is doing extremely well. We have 38,000 students who've all come to campus. Campus is alive, it's electric on all of our campuses. We are really trying to build the leaders of tomorrow, and we're doing it with your help. We are, in terms of how we're performing across the country and around the world, it is really just spectacular how far we've come in a very, very short period of time. And it's because of, through your help and your support, that not only we're getting us here, but also where we're going to go in the future. You saw that we were the youngest university to reach top 5 in the country. That is an amazing accomplishment because of the quality of our scholars and our students. And those funds that come into Calgary create jobs. They create new ideas. They create new enterprises. And you saw also that we were #1 university in the country for the 3rd year in a row in new company creation. And that means adding a vibrancy to Calgary, giving our young students the opportunity to grow their enterprises here and then spread them around the world. So really thank you for being here tonight and to help us move forward. Help us with our students, our learning spaces, and our life-changing research. They truly are legacy donations. Whether they help fund new buildings or whether they benefit students directly, as we saw earlier tonight in the video. And on behalf of the drama students who benefit each year by receiving the Michael Brendan Fisher Summers Kindness Award, thank you, Brenda, for your kindness. That video was just so impactful, and we really appreciate the honor and pride of moving forward Michael's legacy. So thank you so much, Brenda. Really appreciate it. We are so proud to grant that award in his name. It's a fitting lead-in to our keynote speaker this evening because Dr. Shane Sinclair is a professor of the Faculty of Nursing and an adjunct professor in the Cumming School of Medicine. He's also the founder and director of the Compassion Research Lab. There are many aspects of the Faculty of Nursing of which we are very, very proud, like our collaboration made possible through philanthropic support, the collaboration with Old Sun Community College, which allows Indigenous students to remain in their community and which shares Indigenous knowledge and traditional teaching. Also, the Health Systems Transformation Initiative called HIVE, a nurse-led initiative to create solutions that promote health and healthcare accessibility, which involves more nurses becoming involved in decision-making affecting their patients. And like our Clinical Simulation Learning Center, in its 13,000 square feet, students experience the chaos, unpredictability, and victories that make up real-life nursing. This incredible work happening in the Faculty of Nursing reflects our commitment to research, learning, and community engagement at every level. At the University of Calgary, I hope you see through tonight, but in other discussions at your table, how the University of Calgary is thriving on innovation, collaboration, and excellence across all of our faculties. We have 14 incredibly strong faculties at the University of Calgary, but they come together across those faculties to work on incredibly important societal challenges. And we're doing, in essence, what great research universities have always done. We improve the world around us. We make it healthier, we make it more sustainable, more equal, and more prosperous. And our research has real impact, and the reason it does is because of the contributions that you have made to the University of Calgary and will make to the University of Calgary. It is just so special. And tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Sinclair about his Compassion Lab. And I've known Dr. Sinclair for a long time, been a big supporter of his work. And he's an internationally recognized and award-winning program that advances our knowledge of this essential, often overlooked element of healthcare. And we are so grateful to Dr. Sinclair's vision and his work. And for that work, this year he received the Alberta Medical Association Medal of Honor. So it is a great pleasure now that I give you this evening's keynote speaker, Dr. Shane Sinclair. Shane?
Thank you, Ed, for that very warm welcome. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight, where I have been tasked with really boiling down what amounts to over a decade of research and boiling it down into a mere 20 minutes. So it's a little bit of a tall order, but I am going to attempt to do that. But as you probably can appreciate, behind what I'm going to speak about tonight is not only a ton of research, but actually a ton of individuals for whom I would not be standing here without their help and their contributions. And I'm talking about people that are students, I'm talking about colleagues, I'm talking about postdoctoral fellows, and I'm also talking about partner organizations that we've had the privilege of working with, not only here in Calgary, but beyond. So, compassion. It's a word that I think we probably have heard a lot about these days. Whether we turn on our TV and see an apparent lack of compassion in certain segments of society, whether we're scrolling through social media, or whether we walk into a bookstore, or perhaps we are in the position of being a patient and we know how important compassion is because of a personal experience that we've either had or one of our loved ones. But what is compassion precisely? Why is it important? And can we actually begin to measure it and to improve it, not only in our healthcare system, but in society and our community at large? Now, my initial interest in the topic of compassion actually began with a single patient interaction that happened probably 15 years ago now. I remember I was sitting at the bedside in the early afternoon taking care of a woman who was admitted with complications due to incurable breast cancer. And I was there providing emotional and spiritual support in the early afternoon when in walked a nurse. She walked into the room, she stopped at the foot of the bed, smiled at the patient, looked at the patient in the eye, and then proceeded to walk around the other side of the bed and to change the IV bag. We continued to converse for 2 to 3 minutes, and when the nurse was done, she finished reprogramming the machine, stopped again at the foot of the bed, looked at the patient again in the eye, gave her an all-knowing nod of acknowledgement, and then she left without saying a single word. And I will always remember the conversation that ensued after that interaction, because the patient looked at me and confided in the form of a whisper, and she said, "I love that nurse." And I was a little bit perplexed because I didn't completely understand why she was saying that. And I think I was also a fair bit jealous because there was no love for me, who'd been busting his butt for 30 minutes, doing the very difficult work of emotional and spiritual support. So I think it was partly due to jealousy, but also due to genuine curiosity, that I asked her, "Can you tell me why you love that nurse? I mean, she came into the room, She looked at you, she smiled, she proceeded to do what we consider to be a fairly routine task, and she left without saying a single word. And I'll always remember what she told me. She said, "I love that nurse because I could tell by the way that she looked at me that she genuinely cared for me." And so I became interested not only in that interaction, but countless interactions that I had at the Foothills Hospital, as well as the Tom Baker Cancer Center thereafter, where people would tell me, "I have the most amazing physician," or "I have the most incredible nurse." And I was always curious as to why was that? What was the most telling reason for that? And inevitably, it came down to one active ingredient that really transcended all of those interactions. And that, of course, is the topic of our conversation tonight, which is the topic of compassion. Now, I'm just noticing, I don't know if there's a compassion, oh, it is working. It was operator error, I think, as they say in the business. Basically, it left me wondering, how can I potentially understand what compassion is about? So I threw myself into the scientific literature thereafter to really understand and try and hack into compassion, to understand what it was, what are the key elements, in a way that is both rigorous, but also in a way that it doesn't lose its meaning or its magic. And in terms of scientific evidence, we now have what I would consider to be a very convincing body of research demonstrating that compassion, specifically more than any other form of care, is associated with positive patient health outcomes, higher patient satisfaction, and it is a key, if not the greatest predictor of the patient experience and overall quality care ratings, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So as you can see here, patients who report receiving compassion from their healthcare providers have less psychosocial distress. They have higher quality of life. They have lower pain scores, less symptom distress, and they have less adverse outcomes. Yet unfortunately, we also know that in our very busy, resource-constrained healthcare system, that physicians and nurses and allied health professionals report not having enough time to provide compassion in their everyday work. Yet ironically, patients tell us that it takes only 40 seconds for them to experience compassion coming from their healthcare provider. But sadly, the most convincing body of evidence actually comes from not only research, but large-scale healthcare reviews where compassion was apparently lacking. These studies and national health reviews from the UK, as well as here in Canada, as well as the United States, have identified a lack of compassion as the chief culprit in system-wide healthcare failures that is significantly associated with increased patient-family complaints, malpractice suits, as well as non-disclosure of medical information, adverse medical events, and yes, even in some instances, increased mortality. So what is now convincingly clear, whether we ask patients, whether we ask family members, whether we ask healthcare providers, is this: if you want to improve not only patients' and family members' experiences of our healthcare system, but healthcare providers and senior leaders' workplace wellness, compassion is essential. Now, unfortunately, we also discovered that while the importance of compassion is increasingly recognized by both patients and family members and is given credence in our healthcare vision statements, in our healthcare policies, our organizational vision statements, our professional practice guidelines, our codes of ethics, and probably you can see these even on the plaques that commemorate the opening of our hospitals. If you go to the Foothills hospitals or any of our hospitals, you often see the word compassion written right there in the vision statement. But ironically, we actually don't know a lot about what compassion precisely is. And up until that point, no one had ever thought that, geez, it might actually be a good idea to go and talk to patients directly and to ask them for their understandings and their experiences of compassion. So we did the unthinkable, and we actually lived to tell it. We went to the bedside. It was very dangerous, but we lived to tell about it. And what we found and what we discovered was the result of sitting down and talking to now what amounts to over 1,000 patients, ranging from as young as 8 all the way to 94. And we were really interested in determining what are the key ingredients, if you will, of compassion. In other words, if we were to sort of slow compassion down, to freeze frame it, what does it consist of? What does it entail? What is needed to be in a relationship in order for it to be considered compassionate? So we went, as I mentioned, to a group of people who up until that point actually had never been asked about their opinions, their experiences of compassion. And of course, I'm talking about patients, and we've since talked to family members, healthcare providers, as well as senior leaders. And the result, after combing through thousands of pages of patient data, was an empirical definition of compassion. And that definition is: compassion is a virtuous response that seeks to address the suffering and needs of a person through relational understanding and action. And illustratively, this is depicted in the compassion model that we developed, which for the first time identified the key domains of compassion. Again, not only from the perspective of patients, but we've subsequently gone back to the other side of the bed rail and confirmed this with healthcare providers as well. The compassion model shows that compassion stems or is birthed within our virtues as human beings. The good and noble professional, but also personal qualities that we bring and healthcare providers bring to the bedside. What am I talking about? I'm talking about things like love, kindness, acceptance, genuineness, understanding. These are the spark plugs of compassion. You need these basic building blocks to first be able to respond to the suffering of another person in order to begin to do something about it. And in doing so, this creates a relational space that you can see there in the middle, where the suffering of that individual is now beginning to be alleviated by the good qualities, the virtues of that responder, or in our instance, that healthcare provider. And interestingly, the definition of compassion that we developed is actually in keeping with the original definition of compassion, which literally means to co-suffer or to suffer with. So compassion involves a willingness to engage, not simply to observe, not simply to feel for another person, but a willingness to engage in the suffering of another person. The other core components of compassion are relational communicating, as you can see there in the middle, which is really this idea of communicating to and from a place of shared humanity. So it's a relationship. Second, compassion involves seeking to understand, a type of understanding that itself is proactive. It's about seeking to understand, number one, who that person is as a unique human being, and number two, what that person's individual needs actually are, what they actually need, which might be very different than what you would need or what I would need if I was in their situation. As one study participant told us, for example, the golden rule is good to a point, but sometimes somebody else might not want what I want. And I would suggest that if we want to create a truly compassionate healthcare system, or we want to personally grow in our own capacity for compassion, the golden rule is a good starting point. But we need to move away from that, which is still very much focused on what I think that other person needs or what I would want if I were in their situation, to the platinum rule. to do unto others as they would want done to them, to first understand who they are and what they actually need, and then to respond accordingly. Finally, compassion requires action. It culminates in actively attending to a person's needs. And in fact, it was action that patients told us was the most distinguishing feature of compassion in comparison to empathy or sympathy. According to patients, while compassion did share a number of characteristics or attributes with empathy, such as emotional resonance and understanding, it extended and deepened these shared characteristics while adding on other things like action and stemming from those virtues that we talked about earlier. Now, while empathy and compassion, I think we could suggest were closer cousins, as it were, when it came to sympathy and compassion, patients had absolutely no problem distinguishing the difference between these two and telling us which one they preferred. In fact, one patient articulately said, "Sympathy is like flattery. It sounds pretty, but it goes nowhere and it does nothing." So patients perceived sympathy as a pity-based response to a distressing situation that's characterized by a lack of relational understanding, and it's really all about the preservation of the observer. Empathy, on the other hand, was defined as an emotional response that acknowledges and attempts to understand an individual's suffering through cognitive empathy, this idea of trying to understand what another person is thinking, as well as affective empathy, this idea of trying to feel what another person is feeling, or emotional resonance. Now, patients also confirmed a number of limitations related to empathy that are actually confirmed in the scientific literature as well. Namely, patients told us, as other researchers have also confirmed, that empathy is affected by things like deservedness. So our ability to be empathetic is affected by whether we feel that other individual in suffering or that other person who has a need is actually deserving of our empathy. It's also affected by relatedness. Whether we feel that we can relate to that individual or not affects our ability to be empathetic. And it also is affected by likability, whether we actually like the person that is in need or not. So what does this mean? Well, this means that our ability to show empathy is affected by our perception of the person in need or the person in suffering. So do we see them as the victim of their suffering, or perhaps we might see them as the cause of their suffering? It affects our ability to be empathetic towards that individual. Empathy is also affected by whether we feel that we can relate to that individual or not. Do they remind us of ourselves, of our loved ones? Are they of the same social, economic, or ethnic background as us? So the good news is that for people that we can relate to, they're more likely to receive empathy from us. But the bad news is for the people that are in other groups, from other walks of life than the dominant culture, are more likely to not receive empathy from us. And finally, empathy is affected by whether we actually like the person or not. So when it comes to healthcare, whether we actually like the patient that we're providing care to. So we're probably more likely to be empathetic to this individual in comparison to an individual such as this. But compassion, as we've heard, extends, at least in principle, to the proverbial difficult patient, to the outcast, to our enemies, to our strangers, to the others, to people that we perhaps are initially challenged to provide empathy towards. But this brings us to a very important part of this talk, the important juncture, because the dessert is kicking in. People are feeling pretty good, but they might be starting to feel a little bit tired. I wouldn't call it compassion fatigue. We can talk about that in a moment. But I think the question that I want to arrive at is simply this question. So what? How does anything that I've said so far actually improve the delivery of healthcare to Albertans? Does compassion actually matter, or has this simply been a theoretical, navel-gazing exercise by a somewhat humorous, I think you could give me that, somewhat humorous, somewhat interesting might be a bit of a push, but I'll take it, but a biased speaker on a particular topic? Well, I'm happy to report that we are changing the way that healthcare is being delivered, not only here in Alberta, but beyond. You see, as a result of this foundational research that we developed here in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Calgary, what has recently been identified as the most valid and reliable patient-reported compassion measure was actually developed right here in the Faculty of Nursing. It's called the SEQ. It's 15 questions in length, and it's not only intended as a measure for research, but it can also be used as a clinometric to assess patients' experiences of compassion in a routine manner in real-time clinical care. As you can see, it's been validated in a number of different settings in acute care, if I can learn how to use this, long-term care, emergency department, home care, primary care, and hospice. It's available not only in English, but French, Spanish, and Mandarin. And it's currently being translated and importantly validated by our research partners into Portuguese, Italian, Dutch, Hindi, and Turkish. And it's changing the way that policymakers and healthcare systems are assessing quality care, causing some researchers and international leaders to argue that compassion needs to be not only considered as an organizational and system priority, but a key performance indicator, a KPI within our healthcare system. And the SEQ is not just changing practice on a global level. It's doing so right here in our own backyard in Alberta. Recently, the Health Quality Council of Alberta adopted the SEQ as part of their province-wide patient experience survey that they administer to patients receiving care across a number of different sectors. And they administered this to emergency department patients, primary care patients, as well as residential care patients. And we recently published the data from the 14 provincial ED departments where we did our study. And we discovered that compassion, again, as measured by the SEQ, if I can move my slide, that would be good. Perfect. So we measured compassion using the SEQ, and we found out that compassion was the single greatest predictor of patients' overall care ratings in a sample of 4,500 emergency department patients. And as you can see, it was the greatest predictor by a long shot. More than wait times, more than clinical communication, and more than pain and symptom issues. So as you can see here in the HQCA's subsequent report to the Minister of Health, if we are interested in improving quality care in Alberta and beyond, while clinical communication, care transitions, and wait times are important, they're vitally important. But if we're not going to be improving compassion, I think we're missing the mark. And as you can see here, 3 of the 5 recommendations from that particular report were recommendations of how we might begin to improve compassion, not only at the bedside, but all the way to the boardroom in our healthcare system. So in having established a rigorous and meaningful way to measure patients' experiences of compassion within the healthcare system, we are currently completing an educational intervention to both frontline healthcare providers and senior leaders. And they're going to educate presenters. One of the amazing things, they're going to educate presenters on how to use one of these devices, which I think is at the heart of compassion. Because competency and compassion are close cousins as well. And I'm competent and a little bit compassionate as well. So we're building this educational intervention because it's one thing to measure something and sort of identify the gaps and problems, but then the question becomes is, well, what are you going to do about it? And so this education intervention that I'll explain in a moment is not only geared towards healthcare providers, but also senior leaders, because we know that you can equip healthcare providers to be more compassionate. We know that you can teach and train people to be compassionate with knowledge and tools that provide compassion, but you need to work within their practice setting and within the larger organization if you want to comprehensively improve and, importantly, sustain compassion. And I would argue that what patients and healthcare providers have taught us over the years, amongst many things, is that compassion is a team sport. We have to create the conditions for compassion to flourish. It's not just simply about resiliency training or giving people skills and tools to do that. We have to work on both sides. The name of the program is ENACT, which stands for an evidence-informed, competency-based, accredited compassion training program, which is the summation of all of our research to date. So we'll be assessing the program from the learner and organizational perspective, but importantly, we'll also be investigating patients' experiences of compassion as measured by the SEQ. And the reason that we're doing that is we want to ensure that our training actually trickles down to what I would argue is our ultimate target audience. People like you and me, people that you know, your family, your friends, people that you love, who experience health issues and have to interact with our healthcare system. They know firsthand not only the power of suffering, but they also know firsthand the power of compassion. So in a nutshell, we've discovered that compassion is not simply a nicety, but a necessity. It's the glue to not only quality healthcare, but to human flourishing and societal well-being. We also know and have discovered that it can not only be measured, but it should be measured. And perhaps it should be considered a key performance indicator within our healthcare system. And we also know that we can improve compassion in our healthcare system, and we can cultivate compassion within healthcare providers. So here at the University of Calgary, compassion is a topic that we're not simply pursuing, but we are leading and making a real-life, everyday impact, not only here in our backyard in Alberta, but on a global scale. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your support. And I want to thank you for being a part of this transforming research that is really changing the way that we're delivering healthcare from the inside out. So thank you very much for having me, and I think we're going to have a time of question and answer at this time. So Kate, I'll invite you back.
Thank you, Dr. Sinclair, for that wonderful presentation. I'm so excited that we get to continue the conversation. So as I mentioned earlier, I used to work for Dr. Sinclair. I was one of his graduate research trainees, and he gave me my first research job, and definitely started something for me, a passion for research, and now I'm pursuing my PhD in the Faculty of Nursing. So thank you so much for your mentorship.
And a member of the Faculty of Nursing. So.
Oh gosh, a loud member of the Faculty of Nursing. All right, so yeah, that experience was transformative for me, and I'm so grateful that I get to pick your brain once more. So Dr. Sinclair, you've talked about the amazing work that you and your team have done over the past decade. When you look to the future, to the next 10 years, what's your vision in terms of advancing compassion research and practice, and what do you need to get there?
Good question. I think in many ways, I've been here for 10 or 11 years, and so I think it's been a wonderful and very productive time for me here at the University of Calgary. But I also think it's time to sort of pass the baton on, as it were, and to really bring up the next generation of researchers. So I'm thinking of things like postdoctoral fellows. I'm thinking of doctoral students that can really take this work forward, because unfortunately I think we do have some people that do some cloning, but cloning me might not be advisable depending on who you talk to. And so I think it's really a time to get some support to be able to sort of train the next group of individuals to do that, because it's taken off. I wouldn't quite say it's viral, but it's really blown me away in terms of the work that we're doing with not only the HQCA but other provinces who are very interested in measuring compassion, as I mentioned, as a KPI. So things like research chairs obviously are things that help us to build capacity beyond myself and to really enhance funding towards trainees. I think the other thing that I have a vision for as well is always thinking outside of the box. So transdisciplinary research is a huge topic here at the University of Calgary. And I think we've begun to do a bit of this, but to really have a dream and to think about, well, what would it look like if we brought together the best scholars across, business, education, different faculties that we have? What does compassion look like in the classroom? From an educator's perspective, what does it look like in the boardroom from a business perspective, so that we can begin to do work in a more transdisciplinary sort of way. So I think the other thing I'll just mention very briefly is one of the things I like about the University of Calgary is that it seems like we're very embedded in our community. And if we were just studying compassion from the ivory tower of main campus, I think there would be something seriously wrong about that. And I think one of the things that I've enjoyed about our research in the Compassion Research Lab is we have very much integrated with organizations in the larger community, whether it's Alberta Health Services, HQCA. And I just think for a topic like compassion, I can't think of I'm a biased person, but I can't think of a better bridge to the community than a topic like compassion. So those are some of the things that I have a heart for and a vision for.
I love that. I can't nod too emphatically. I'm worried about my mic, but I agree with everything you're saying wholeheartedly. And you're a wonderful mentor, so I know you're going to do a great job of training that next generation. So what are some of the myths and misconceptions about compassion that you feel hinder the advancement of compassion science? And what are you, or how might you, begin to address them?
So I think there's actually a lot of them. And maybe this is what happens when you put your nose into a field. You understand what something is, but you also understand more and more what it's not. One of them is this idea of compassion fatigue. So again, I always preface this by saying the burnout epidemic that we are seeing in healthcare is absolutely real. It's absolutely something that we need to address. But the problem with labeling it as compassion fatigue is now compassion becomes the tiring part of that. In other words, the more compassionate you are, somehow the more fatigued that you become. And we know that there's actually no evidence for that. We know that when we allow nurses, for example, to do what I think the vast majority of them signed up for a nursing career in the first place to do, which is to provide compassionate health care. They will flourish and they will do what they're made to do if we provide the ability to do that. So it's not the compassion that is burning out people. So that's one of my hobby horses, as you can probably see. I think the other thing is just, even in developing an education intervention, there's a lot of myths that you can't teach compassion. We actually know there's a ton of evidence that you can, and probably as much evidence showing that you can do a very effective job of not making people compassionate. And so in certain sectors of healthcare, there's been a lot of research where individuals going through medical school, for example, they've actually shown have decreased levels of empathy and compassion. It wasn't at the University of Calgary, none of these studies were, but at other centers. But the idea is that we're training people, in a way to cram their heads with such important and vital information. But we're untraining them in the innate ability that they bring. So that's another myth, that you can't train it. We ran into the myth that you can't measure it. I think we've debunked that myth in saying that we can absolutely measure it, and we can do it in a way that is rigorous, but in a way that doesn't sort of dumb down the magic of compassion and make it into this ticky box system where you have healthcare providers coming, and if they sit down and nod at you in a certain way and look at you and have a certain tone of voice, it's this mechanical, contrived compassion. So that would be another myth. I think that compassion is weak would be another one. I think compassion is radical. I think healthcare providers have told us that sometimes compassion is about being rebellious and breaking, I dare say, system rules and putting people before policy. So I think to be compassionate is sometimes radical. It's not a weak thing. It takes it takes a lot of courage to be compassionate, particularly in challenging situations. So those are some of the myths that I think I've sort of interacted with around compassion specifically.
Thank you for that. That's radical compassion is a term I'll be taking to my practice.
I think Brene Brown already has that covered, or something along those lines.
Shane Sinclair, TM.
Yeah.
One of the things I learned from you is the importance of putting patients in the center of your research. And I'm just wondering, why do you feel that patient engagement is so important to your work?
I think just having been a clinician and being a spiritual health practitioner, I worked largely in palliative care with dying people. And I didn't coin this phrase, somebody else did, but I asked a physician one day when I was doing my doctoral research, why do you work with dying people? And the person said, I'm not sure. I think it's probably because I've seen some of the most alive people that I've met some of the most alive people ever working in palliative care. And I think he was talking about patients, but I know he was also referring to the people that he worked with, because those environments change you as an individual. And so I think that sort of clinical sensibility, patients have so much wisdom that we can interact with, we can engage with, and we can bring the best of science, the best of research. But I think we're also very short-sighted sometimes in terms of what we think is actually important. And what matters to patients is certainly, like I said, wait times. Having good clinical communication is important. I'm not taking away from any of that. But if you ask any of them what's important, it usually does boil down to aspects of compassion. Now, they don't want to have a highly compassionate nurse or a highly compassionate physician who's incompetent. So there is a mix and a blend that's there. But often the things that are remembered the most are those sort of things. So I was young when I was working in clinical care. I still like to think I'm young. I still think I can maybe pull that off. But because of that, I think I'm very aware of the wisdom that they bring in. So we've been totally intentional before patient-orientated research was a big topic, that we have patient advisors on our research team. We're always interfacing with patients when we develop an educational intervention. People told us, patients told us, like, just be careful that you're not training medical residents, nurses to come into the room and to sort of speak in that slow, methodical voice. Because if that's what training someone to be compassionate is all about, I don't really want any of that. And so I think it keeps us real. And I just think they bring so much wisdom, particularly to this topic, that we would be foolish to not talk to them.
Even the wisdom of 8-year-olds, as we learned.
And I was just thinking of you because Kate was involved in our pediatric study, so that might have actually been you interviewing the 8-year-old that we had. But
I think it was.
Yeah. So thanks for that as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time tonight to educate us about a groundbreaking area of research that's so important. It's been so fascinating to hear about your pivotal role in the field of compassion. And now you get to sit back and relax. And I'm going to go up here.
Thank you very much.
So as we wind down, I'd like to say again to our Legacy Society members, thank you for your generosity, your confidence in our vision, and for pledging your support to the University of Calgary for generations to come. For those of you who aren't members, I do encourage you to learn more about legacy giving at UCalgary. So from myself, Ed McCauley, Andrea Morris, and the entire University of Calgary family, thank you and good night.